Discuss for about 20 to 25 minutes about the concept of food sovereignty that Nora already introduced in a presentation, and how we should take food sovereignty seriously. So it's my great pleasure, Luigi, to give you the floor, and thanks a lot.
Well, so it is my duty and my pleasure to initiate this post-lunch session. So one thing that I know as a student of the IUC about post-lunch sessions is that a kind of sleepiness tends to set in. So in that case, my advice is that you gently slide towards the edge of the seat and rest your head against the back should you feel sleepy at any point. I'm very grateful to be here today because, as Tommaso already mentioned, we're both IUC students from a number of cohorts back. And the IUC is a place that sort of tends to linger in the sort of meanders of the heart long after you leave. And so I'm very grateful. It's a very special day for me as well to be here today. I also wanted to thank Tommaso because he has been the kind of mastermind behind today. So he sort of invited Nora, and so we managed to expand our contacts. And also he accommodated the schedule somewhat. So today I wanted to start with, so you might have heard that we are trying to create a new degree at the IUC. And so we've been having an internal debate about what the meaning is of engaging academically. So we have been sort of weighing the potentials and pitfalls of taking this step into the world of food. Now in this talk, I want to grapple with that question. And I want to do so, however, in a spirit of experimentation and curiosity, which I think is quintessentially IUC. As opposed to focusing on the complete narratives of work that I've already done. Because the reason I've sort of been entrusted with dealing with food is that I wrote a book on food and finance a few years ago, but today I want to present something that is still in the making and possibly amateurish in the sense that it's a work of love. So hopefully we're going to have a bit of fun thinking about it already. Now the crux of the internal debate that we've been having at the IUC has been about assessing the relevance of what it means to do critical scholarship grounded in food issues, beyond whether that engagement is relevant beyond a circumscribed circle of food scholars. So is it possible to reach beyond specialist food scholars, and what does that mean for our identity as an academic institution? How can food be interesting to all of us, whether as citizens, as researchers, of a supposed non-food camp, or generally to people who would, if probed in earnest, disclose that they would rather not literally ethnic peasants. Indeed, in this talk, I would like to compose a few suggestions to show how, if we take food sovereignty seriously, we end up with a much broader set of transformative possibilities than adhere to food narrowly understood. But first, we need to set the terms of our debate straight, and I need to have a sip of water. Now, food sovereignty, as you may have gathered from Nora's talk earlier today, is one term of a dyad or a dichotomy, so it's often used in opposition to food security. Now, why is that? I want to sort of start from that again. Food security, from its very name, already cues its opposite, food insecurity. Food enters the picture here as a resource that has already been framed and valued in the way value is produced and understood in a capitalist market economy, namely through the comparative scarcity of an item's availability. What I mean by that is that a resource is only valuable in a market economy insofar as there's not enough of that resource to satisfy demand, therefore that attracts a particular price. So that's the definition of how markets achieve a price, by mediating between comparative scarcity of a resource and the demand for that resource. Now in the food security narrative, therefore, the reason for engaging with food is that it is supposedly scarce, and that this scarcity and the associated precariousness that this induces in the conditions for human life needs to be somehow corrected. In this sense, therefore, we talk of food security But we could talk also of housing security or health security or security in a number of other goods and services that compose a basic picture of human dignity and which come to be denied in the name of the supposed centrality of market mechanisms to allocate those to people in need. This still forgets, however, that markets do not function according to need, but rather by definition they provision for needs as long as these can attract a sufficient price, and the goods and services that could meet them are sufficiently scarce relative to the very needs they're supposed to satisfy. So to talk of food security is only partly encouraging, in that at least it acknowledges a problem with subjecting food and other essentials to the allocative logic of markets, and the fact that markets value something only insofar as it is scarce, not because it's a human need. However, most people who engage with food out of a desire to address food security, they do so, I'm sure, in a spirit of genuine care and concern. But food security does not go far enough. So this is why I want to suggest here that we start taking food sovereignty seriously, and I want to suggest that food sovereignty is a much more revolutionary concept, and one the ramifications of which have the potentials to signify and catalyze much broader processes of cultural transformation. Food security, after all, food security is the first one, positions itself as the corrective to a mechanism, the centrality of market allocation and evaluation through scarcity and closure, which seems only problematic when it touches food, but which it doesn't challenge per se. So food security doesn't say much as a critique of markets. It just says that markets fail to deliver enough food. So it's kind of it only bites halfway. So food security, paradoxically, can then serve as a tool to make more tolerable or sustainable the constitutive presence of extractive and abstracting processes and practices along the food chain, or the food web, more correctly. So it's a bit like the packaging to a packet of cigarettes. To write smoking kills on the package acknowledges there is something wrong with the consumption of cigarettes, but does not say much about the economic processes that lead to that packet of cigarettes being produced and delivered to your shop in the first place. So similarly, food security acknowledges a problem with the underavailability of food for consumption, but it doesn't take this awareness further to use food as a lever to hack the basic rules of the economic system. Now, food sovereignty instead has an altogether different bent. The idea of sovereignty, in fact, first of all implies reference to a subject, someone that is exercising sovereignty, that is. That subject is typically understood as a collective. So food sovereignty could be dubbed in plain English as the aspiration to ensure deliberation by collectives about arrangements pertaining to the production, distribution, and consumption of food. Now, immediately we can see that on this reading, the problem is not so much one that is limited only to the stage of consumption and shortage at the point of consumption, shortage of food at the point of consumption, but one that embraces the very processes by which food is produced and the sorts of relationships out of which the value of that food is construed, emerges. However, if food sovereignty, so I want you now to think let's go deeper in the term. If food sovereignty implies collective deliberation, so a subject that is sovereign, the key to unpacking this term is to try to figure out what we mean by collective. What are the collectives that food sovereignty places in a sovereign position, so to say? That is the question I want to deal with. Well, food sovereignty refers to no collectives in particular by means of an abstract definition that I could relate to you. The way food sovereignty identifies collectives is akin to the way you distinguish a collective of sheep by their common grazing habits or spaces, for instance. We can think of collectives being brought together by common material practices of engaging with the living earth. And as such, we can equally distinguish collectives, for example, of rice growers in the Chinese plains, brought together by the rice growing, or the collectives assembled by the stingy slopes of the hills of southern Piedmont, where I come from, that have been so aptly described by famous Italian writers like Nuto Revelli and Cesare Pavese, for those of you who have part of their hearts with them. So in other words, a collective is less a collection of people or things formulated in the abstract, but rather it is a process that collects an undeniably material and corporeal activity. Food sovereignty scholars sometimes refer to this phenomenon as co-production. The idea of co-production, in other words, is that the way food is originated implies a negotiation between different subjects. On the one hand, humans and their skills as growers and peasants, and on the other hand, other subjects, the biological, climatic, and geological processes that interfere and mingle with human activity. So both are subjects. Some of them are non-human. And it is the material negotiation between these subjects, some of which, as I said, are non-human, gathers the collectives to which food sovereignty suggests we should listen to, first and foremost, when we try to understand the world of food. Now, this is interesting beyond the world of food, if you think about it, and it ties in well with the general feel of some of the things that were said this morning. So the essential difference between these two items is that the food in food security is an object. It is affected by manipulative processes that conserve food or have to do with its life, but where food is a fundamentally passive entity. The food in food sovereignty, instead, is a subject that assembles the collective, like the rice growers brought together by the rice growing and not being a collective without the rice growing that makes it complete. To take food sovereignty seriously, in other words, means philosophically, and more than philosophically, even at an embodied level, I would say, to become open to the possibility that we really live in a world of which we are just one of its possible subjects. It is, in this sense, a world that is ultimately brimming with life in everything. To give you an example, I want to play with the title of a famous book, The Secret Life of Trees, which nudges us precisely towards an awareness of this sort. The tree is not just a thing, something passively there, or rather, it is a thing in the original Norse etymology of the word. A thing in Norse meant a gathering where people assembled to discuss a matter or thing. That's where the word thing comes from. It used to be an assembly of people. Hence, a thing from its origins is tied to its ability to assemble and bring together subjects. The tree, as we know when it is felled and stops doing what it does as a subject, assembles the ground with its roots. As well as, it also scaffolds the surrounding environment in microclimates, because some parts around the tree are shady, some are not, some are covered by vegetation, some are not, and so on. And these microclimates become suited to the life of other species of plants and animals, from worms to birds. If you think of the great variety of living beings that dwell in a tree, you can really start seeing the tree as a subject. And this quality of trees is actually something that has applications in organic agriculture, and it is known as forest gardening. The idea behind it being precisely that you take advantage of the tree's subjectivity in structuring the space around it. And this is embodied in a kind of unspoken practice of agriculture. That's something we can begin to learn then from agricultural practices. So I want to push this even further. When you look at the terraced slope of a hill, you can ask yourself whether it was the people who terraced it who made the hill what it is, or you can ask yourself whether it was the hill that gathered and rooted the community dwelling on the hill in the stones of its terraces, having enticed that community with its qualities of shape, sun exposure, or unique climatic or geological properties. Think of soil composition and how it matters in choosing where to place a vineyard, because it will affect the flavor of the grapes and the wine. So the food sovereignty paradigm in this sense is underpinned by a philosophy of radical subjectification, which ultimately is a philosophy of life. If things are alive, in other words, engagement with the world is perforce to become less abstract and rationalistic. This philosophy definitely stands counter to the view from above that so often tends to inform our ways in policy and academic circles. It is instead a philosophy that can speak to bodies in their incarnated acts of placemaking. The tree that holds the surrounding earth and its dwellers in place. The hill that gathers and holds the terracing community of peasants. In this sense, it is a philosophy that is not so much characterized by a rigid set of principles that capture something about the world. Rather, it is a minimal philosophy. Indeed, I would say, as faint as the unspoken poise of someone with ears ready for listening. Because in a world of living things, where things are constantly birthing new forms, thinking needs to become less policy-driven. That is, it needs to become less convinced and presumptuous that it can encompass the evolution of the world in a few broad strokes of the pen, and more body-driven. It can only spring, I think, from material encounters with the fabric of the world that are precariously balanced, unfirm, and invariably poetic, because they are invariably creative. It is no surprise that some of the simplest material activities that stem from the practice of smallholder peasant agriculture have formed the blueprint for poetic expression, precisely in that it captures the ineffable, silent and unspoken bodily negotiation of hands and legs with materials that come alive in the presence of gifted hands. I will give you some examples. Take an incredibly detailed portrait of seed casting. In the song of my fellow townsman Gian Maria Testa, he connotes the sowers by their slow, still and cautious treading, scanning the ground with their eyes, looking paradoxically for what is not there, the holes and fissures that the ground lends them where they may cast their seeds, and leave behind them things not previously there, the seeds now sown, silently tending to the transformation of a place with a gesture as simple as a flick of a hand. Or take this almost animistic passage from an Indian poet, Jigtai's poem, The Boatman. Ask why, when he puts his oar in the lake, he asks the water. If it is possible to capture in poetry this ambivalence and this precarious balancing in a flow of negotiations between living subjects, human and non-human, it's not only because of the poets themselves, but also because of the poetic and creative processes that can be discovered as an essential feature of acting ethically in a world of subjects. This is taking us quite far from food itself, I'm aware. And this is...
I have a question. I think you should, complete the item of your subjectification challenging the word food. Because the problem with food is that it is an object insofar as it is going to feed something else, someone else. So while the tree is not food in itself, you can make it partly food. Food, from the start, is understood as something which is for someone else's well-being. So you should try and work on that. And whose sovereignty? Is it food sovereignty or who else? The environment sovereignty, the earth's sovereignty, the trees' sovereignty, the river's sovereignty? And since we are lawyers, or you are, I'm not, then legal personhood should be then understood as part of this subjectification. Legal personality. Okay.
Well, now I'm at sort of.
It wasn't meant to be a terroristic act.
No, I know. I was just trying to.
But since you are making it philosophical, then let's talk philosophy.
So I should address the question after finishing my utterance.
Absolutely.
So in fact, as Pepe was remarking, in a way, we have ended up rather far from food itself. And I've done this in an explicitly unprincipled and open-ended manner. But I find this a much more precise description of what it means to actually be in relation to living form and follow its blossoming. Food sovereignty, as I see it, is therefore not merely about protecting peasants. In fact, this is probably the wrong way to talk about it in the first place, because it construes peasants as the terminal of another one's helping. And also it abstracts them from the material life world they dwell in, and which makes them what they are, the non-human subjects that they develop their identity in dialogue with, their environment. Food sovereignty signifies for me a philosophy of radical subjectivation and respect for the forms of life that exist in the world, and that conversely give the world the form it has by their existence. It's a philosophy of radical participation that can act as guidance way beyond the world of peasant agriculture, and this is something that I think is an important point of what I was trying to say, which in fact we could think of applying in anything from schools to business organizations as a principle of engaging with other subjects. It is a philosophy also that is not just a philosophy, insofar as it entails a certain bodily receptivity, an anticipation for listening, for midwifing the birth and renewal of biological and social life forms. In this sense, food sovereignty entails, I would say, a listening to the life world of peasants, not to make all of us into peasants, of course, no, but to learn by watching and revering their rhythm and their craft, which can serve as intuitive metaphors to help us be like peasants in our ability to see subjects inhabit the worlds we co-create. In the collective forms and relationships we have to cultivate, we come to cultivate as lawyers, educators, or activists. And I think this ability to relate to the life world of peasants as a source of metaphors that will guide our ethical intuition in whatever we engage in is ultimately a much, I think, a much broader consequence of taking food sovereignty seriously than merely focusing on just the sort of the peasant center, the peasant origin of this. So this is, I come to the end of my utterance now. So Pepe's question, I must say, I didn't quite understand what you were suggesting. So I will ask you to maybe rephrase it if you can.
I rephrase it. I could make it even a little more interesting with the parallel. There is a word which comes from the Latin, and it is understood as one of the main, let's say, paradigms of English Marxism, or Marxism in English, which is reification, okay? Which is sometimes translated as objectification, okay? In German, the word is, in fact, thingification, so reification would be. Now, you see, what you are suggesting is a parallel process by which, instead of being objectified, food takes the stand as the subject, okay? My question is, okay, how do you make it linguistically possible, since food we understand immediately as something which is for us to enjoy? This is important because, you know, if you make it a complete subject, then all of a sudden the tree will not be food in itself, but will be the tree. And in fact, you have an interesting linguistic shift when you describe the tree assembling. You don't make it food assembling anything. You make it the tree, but the tree is different from food, you know. And that is something that in your line of reasoning you should solve, okay? Because it opens up to a process of subjectification. And it opens up to rights and responsibilities, not only of the peasants, of Arcadia, but also of other legal personalities. The river, the tree who's assembling, the hill who's shaping herself, and so on and so forth. You know, they become persons of themselves.
Okay, so I'll try to compose an answer to this. Now, I would try to argue something like that. That food is. So you mentioned that food is something for us to enjoy. That
etymologically.
Yes, I mean that is already a loaded way of framing it.
Yeah.
I think, because you can look at food as a thing, and sort of what you mentioned, the reification of food, I think is what leads people to look at food in a kind of prepackaged way. So the food is the tomato I buy at the supermarket, that's food. Whereas the processes whereby that food is made, how do we call those? So I would rather call those processes food rather than the end product, because looking at the end product leads you into a kind of into a reifying or objectifying way of looking at food, because then it becomes a quantitative question, and then we fall back into food security, which thoroughly embodies this idea. It's not misguided, of course. We want to look at food also quantitatively so that everyone can have a certain amount of food so that their bodies can withstand the growing heat. But at the same time, there's something, food is both something that feeds, if you allow me a pun, into a feeding process of people feeding themselves. But what I wanted to give a sense in the talk, especially when I was talking about the terrace and the terracing community, is that there is also something, a kind of identitarian or meaningful process in the way people engage with food. I mean, when the peasant, or even us, you know, even when we engage with food, food is tied up with a whole host of identity-building things. You know, you will drink, you know, some kind of organic apple juice or something, and that means both that you are caring for something, but also that situates you in a kind of perhaps crowd of people that are consuming those kinds of things, as opposed to Coca-Cola, for example. So there is this. There is, of course, the metabolic aspect of food. So food is about nourishing our bodies, but at the same time, everything, I would say, in the world, because it's a world of subjects, engages with things out of meaning as well. And by that, I would say that even the tree, as it is scaffolded in an area, it's doing that both as a metabolic way to feed itself, but it's also doing that as a way of homing in and making an area known to itself and conducive to the tree, sort of to its own permanence in that area. And I would call that something having to do with meaning or with understanding one's surrounding or with building one's home. So similarly with peasants, of course peasants have to do, and peasant agriculture and smallholder agriculture has to do with producing food, but at the same time there are also many things that are tied up, religious identities, gender identities, because many smallholders are also women, which I think is, I think it would not be just for us to think that food does not include those things. I think it would impoverish both the kind of scholarship that we produce and ourselves as beings. So I think that this awareness, of course, I don't have a complete, and my presentation is incomplete precisely because I wasn't trying to provide a recipe to the problems of the world, and in fact I was partly arguing against the idea that anyone anywhere can have the recipe to solving problems of the world. But rather I was trying to say, let's think of this awareness, and how does that awareness transform the way that we would go back into a policy institution and try to change its ways. And primarily the way we do that is as bodies engaging with other bodies. And for that I see a lot of potential as well. So this sort of hands in the air. But Sasha.
Yeah, I think what Tommaso mentioned, the fetishism of commodities, I don't know if you thought about it in the context of the distinction between food sovereignty and food security. It seems to me, and also it is related to the question of thingification, because Marx says that with fetishism of commodities, in capitalism, the relations between people present themselves as relations between things. That is, we have food as a commodity in market with a price, and we relate to each other as producers, sellers, and buyers of the food. So the thing that seems to me important here is to see that this thingification, the looking at the food not as a subject but as an object, you could say, is an objective representation. In a sense, this is not a philosophical stance. This is the socially constituted objectivity of the relations which we live in. So to say we should think about food from the perspective of food sovereignty, which seems to me legitimate and interesting, I would say that we should take into account the problem that the way that we look at food as the object, as the thing, is connected to the social construction of capitalism, in which it is, if you want or do not, whatever way you want to look at food, you have to buy it at the marketplace, And this is the way that our social relations are organized around this fact, that we produce it for money and buy it with money. So it seems to me that to push this a bit further, we should think about how to tackle the objective foundation, social foundation of the thingification that happens in capitalism. If I'm
you raise a fascinating point, and in fact, I think it allows me to expand very briefly because I think the reason that I try to develop something like this, and for those of you who will be attending my course, the course itself, was precisely asking myself this question. That a lot of literature that you read on this is very critical of things. And criticism, while of course it's necessary and undeniable, and I'm not, and I think we went straight to the sort of jugular of the problem and said, when there's a problem with commodification in structures, fine. So the problem is taking those structures away. I agree with that. Then that engages us in thinking, well, how do we envisage the idea of revolutionizing that system? Because a lot of people tend to think of revolution as a kind of discrete process. Something is there, then something breaks, and a new system arises. Whereas I think by trying to outline this idea of a philosophy of subjects, and even in the kind of broader political purpose of the course I've designed, is to actually make us aware of the fact that there are already in existence, and they're much more ubiquitous than we would think they are, economic structures that look primarily at needs and provisioning, and therefore have a greater potential for engaging the people as the subjects that we would like them to be and to relate to one another as. So it's a kind of, you've heard the term, prefigurative type of politics. So I feel that, I think with this sort of advertising to my, oh, sorry.
Could I just add a word coming from the subjects who gave birth to the term food sovereignty, because I actually witnessed the whole process, having been a part of it. And just to say a couple of things. This is not to speak against anything, but just to add another dimension and another flavor to this. First of all, in fact, it was peasants who came forward with this idea. It wasn't, shopkeepers in Chicago where I was born. And there's probably a reason for that, and it's interesting to find out what it was. And for them, food was never this reified object. Food is part of community. Food is culture. Food is intergenerational. Food is relationship to nature. Many of the things that we now feel we have to rediscover were part of their basic understanding of what you were talking about when you said food. And secondly, the peasants were, their subjectivity was being totally negated. One of my dearest friends, one of the peasant leaders of Senegal, told me that when the census was being done in Senegal shortly after independence, and he was asked to write his métier, his profession, and he wrote peasant, and the answer was, peasant's not a profession, what are you talking about? So part of the whole food sovereignty movement was reconquesting a subjectivity, not by a tree, but by a person, by whole sets of people whose identity had been negated. And so that's how, and of course the whole enclosure process that people we talked about this morning, they were being, their identity was being negated, they were being kicked off their land, there were, all of these things were happening to them. So I think it's important for us to understand what sense all of this had when it was being born, and also what kind of a process this idea has gone through, and the kind of multiplication or multiple view of subjectivity that you're talking about now was something that happened to the food sovereignty movement, particularly when the encounter with indigenous peoples took place. And there, the whole idea that Mother Earth has rights. It's not just rights are not only lodged in individuals or even collectivities of human beings, but also in Mother Earth, and hence in the discrete parts of Mother Earth. And this is something that has progressively been taken on by the food sovereignty movement. So the food sovereignty movement is very much a living thing, and it develops. It was born in the rural areas and peasant communities. It has developed from the south to the north, out of rural areas into urban areas, into all sorts of, this broadening of the idea of what is meant by food sovereignty, and who are the actors and the subjects, the multiple actors and the subjects, and how they relate to them, to each other. One of the most fascinating workshops I ever attended was a workshop of fisher folk and pastoralists and indigenous peoples and peasants, talking about how they should manage their own conflictual relations with regard to territory, and these relations are often conflictual because of the pressures that have come from outside, but this whole idea of relationship and of building community and of building capacity for people to manage their relationships and their relationships with territory and with nature is. And I think what I'm saying is that let's not disembody food sovereignty from where it came from, and let's understand how it's grown, and then see how we can use that to take it even further. but that there is a sense, and there's a very human and political and social and cultural sense to how this idea was born and how it's developed.
Thank you. I don't have much to add to that really, except that I wasn't necessarily trying to disembody food sovereignty. I was merely trying to make an argument that some of the advocacy around food sovereignty requires a close look at material practices, and some people, for instance, talk of as co-production. And I think those sort of concepts are something that has quite a strong ability to exceed the world of food into a broader critique of the economic system and its objectifying tendency. So that was the kind of, so if we take food sovereignty seriously, it's not just a food thing. It's something having to do with life. And I think I didn't want to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I wanted to kind of make it a nice, warm and cozy bath.
Can I ask something? So thanks a lot for the presentation. I just have a question about the construction or the identification of collectivities. So you were talking about this idea, the common habits, and that relates with something that Nora just mentioned, which is the conflicts between collectivities, so groups of fisher folks and groups of farmers conflicting for the territory. And I was just wondering if you see this idea of what's the collectivity, is there identification, is there construction, is there a bottom-up process, is it something that that comes out spontaneously, because something that really puzzles me is when we talk about the commons, for example, and we assume that if a community organizes itself and if there is a community there managing a resource, definitely that's going to be good. And we often forget that there are other collectivities, other communities, other groups that maybe have an interest on that resource, and then you create a conflict that the notion itself of common is not really dealing with. So is it something that you're looking at, how this maybe food sovereignty of one community, of one collectivity can struggle or can clash with the food sovereignty of another one? Or
I think this is a fabulous point, because when I said that I thought food sovereignty has to do with people engaging with one another as subjects, some of the most radical practices today that experiment with this sort of radical acknowledgement of other people and things' subjectivity are not shorn of conflict. So I didn't want to confuse this idea. If you look at consensus assemblies, they are some of the most conflictual settings that you can be in. So rather, and this takes me to a kind of rather non-philosophical tone of my talk, is how do you, part of the experimentation in something like Occupy assemblies does not really happen at the level of principle so much, but rather at the level of how do people deal with other people saying something or making a kind of material stance or organizing. How do you develop the unspoken skills to try and understand what kind of form, collective form, something is evolving to? And I think that is something for which words are very poor, and part of this experiments like Occupy is a kind of self-pedagogy to try and teach oneself how to do that. Some of the most mediating people I've met were living in intentional communities, and these are people who have to argue about everything from like the tea in the morning to some. So their life is a constant negotiation, and the kind of experimentation that arises and the kind of subjects that you meet cannot help but strike you as people who have a kind of implicit ability to try and acknowledge as much as possible your subjectivity, and there are cultural ways of dealing with that. So in that sense, food sovereignty as the acknowledgement of radical acknowledgement of subjectivity does not preclude conflict, but rather it would ask the fishermen and the other users of the land, how would you want to settle this in a way that furthers your humanity and that of the other person, as opposed to bashing yourself? So that entails a kind of hope that people can educate themselves to solve things in ways that recognize and acknowledge the other in a kind of Buberian way, if you allow me a theological foray. So yes, I think I leave it at that. There were no people slumbering, so I'm grateful for you at least trying to stay awake to this rather. I don't usually do presentations like this, but I thought today I would take a risk because it's the first day of the year.
So if there are no more questions.
No.
No.
Be brave and speak up, guys. I can see you are
Yeah.
perplexed or even, in great scandal. So challenge what our friend has been saying till now.
Please.
I have a question. So, do you distinguish between food and food systems, or do you consider them the same thing?
What do you mean by food systems?
Well, that was sort of, I don't know the terminology, and I don't know much about this
No, but
field,
what do you mean?
I thought it was sort of what you were discussing, like everything from, the growing of food, not just the final product that comes out of the supermarket or the farmer's market. You look at the whole process and all the systems surrounding it, all of the people and communities surrounding it, and how it relates to any other systems, ecological, etc.
Well, I think, food. See, I think there's a distinction to be made here between food, which per se denotes some kind of material thing, and food systems, which is already an analytical concept that you're introducing. So in that sense, yes, there is a distinction, obviously, in the sense that food systems is something that we can use to help us understand food. And in that sense, it's only useful insofar as it's helpful, acknowledge and be respectful to subjectivities. But at the same time, I think it's the point I was trying to make, I think, was precisely to break away from a concept that there is such a sector such as food, and there being other things such as ecology and other things having to do with law and other things being economics. And I was trying to say, rather than follow the topic, follow the problem. So if you start from the problem, then you end up with a whole host of things. You can end up with gender issues, you can end up with critiques of the economic system, you can end up, I hope, with philosophical debates about things. So the two things are not exclusive at all, and I don't feel like criticizing an idea of food systems insofar as I do see academic practices of understanding and analysis as important and conducive, as long as they're not the only way that we approach things, and we don't forget that we have bodies as well, even if you're academics or scholars or policymakers. So I think this is my very sort of unsatisfactory answer to you, I suppose. But that's as far as I can get.
One last question.
I am not very much comfortable defining food a thing in just that sense, because it's very much diminutive of the last summer I was in Paris, where I met all part of the world. We were trying to kind of define food in such a way that it conveyed our identity, because it's a culture, it's what we are. But when we talk about it and kind of observe it in that sense as observer independent or observer dependent, I prefer us to observe food as observer dependent, because as we are the people observing, we are completely dependent on food. But if you look at it from an observer independent view, we put a little value on it. So the discussion from where it starts, using and defining food a thing, kind of closes the discussion to a less important matter that we're discussing about. So what I want you to understand there is, we should talk about food as a culture and not as a subject or a kind of, I don't know, actually, but the discussion is much philosophical from my understanding.
Yes, I think we are saying the same thing in a way, except that I probably explained myself poorly. So we have, conventionally when we say something is a thing, we tend to assume that it's something other than ourselves, and that we do, to which it's the terminal of our activity. So I can take that bottle, I can crumple it, I'm dealing with it as a thing. But rather, I was trying to convey the sense that even objects that we regard as things actually have a kind of agency. So they do things. So it's not only people consuming food, but it's also food structuring people's identities and cultures. And to try and convey that and criticize this idea of thing in exactly the way that you were doing, I said, let's go to the origin of the word. And the origin of the word actually means something very different from what we think thing means, because a thing was originally an assembly, so it was a process that brought people together. So so it was something that offered a reason for people to do something, rather than, and then the matters that used to be discussed in the thing assemblies became called thing. So what is the matter we're discussing today? It's this thing, but rather thing began as a process, as an active doing of something. And so food resembles to me a bit like a thing in the sense of an assembly, that it assembles a lot of people who grow it, the earth that grows that food, the ecological processes, the geological ages of the earth, and the consumers, and everyone in between. Cultures, identities, gender. So I think I explained myself poorly, but I wasn't trying to say something different from what you said.
You see,
Okay.
what you were trying to say is that we should consider food as a broader concept because it has so many
Implications.
So many implications, and there's a whole bunch of things surrounding it. Like, because I've been thinking, like, since the first lecture in the morning, like, I'm thinking about food because maybe I don't understand many complex things or philosophical discussions, but I always try to, like, while you were talking, I was trying to put all of these that you were saying in a concrete example, like reflecting about my country's relation with food sovereignty, that we don't have food sovereignty because we import 80% of the food that we consume, that we also help the global capitalist system, and that we have a banking system that all these corporations that manage food, laundry, like money laundry, the money in my country, and all these things that are around the same subjects that we are hearing since this morning. So I think I get your point that it's that we have to think about a lot more when we think about one subject. In this case, food sovereignty, isn't it? But I don't know if I arrived exactly to what you were trying to.
No, I think you're close. I think I would just add to that that I was trying to not make food a subject at all. So I was trying to say food is a process entangled with life, and as living beings, us as well as the environment, there's a kind of duty upon ourselves to try and make that speak in a way that is conducive to its ongoing reproduction. So in that sense, I was trying to engage with it less as a kind of subject, but also I think all of the issues that you bring up, the policy arrangements and so on. This talk replaced the talk that I was originally going to give about derivatives. And even derivatives do something, financial instruments, affect the way the food is grown, so ultimately have material effects. And the material effects are what has brought us into what is called the Anthropocene, so the era where we recognize that human activity on Earth is a geological force, so we actually are a geological force. So I think I'm probably digressing here now, so I think I'll stop, because I've kind of...
An applause for our charismatic friend. And the floor to